Welcome to Reinventing You, a podcast of the Association for Undergraduate Education at Research Universities, which is abbreviated URU to emphasize the UERU in our name. URU is a Boyer-inspired national consortium of 125 U.S. research universities dedicated to growth and development in undergraduate education at research universities, or in the language of the Boyer 2030 Commission's report, the Equity Excellence Imperative. Many of us are dedicated to the proposition that equity and excellence are inextricably entwined in democratic society, and therefore that in pursuit of excellence, it is imperative that we address students' needs fairly and effectively.
We're your hosts, Steve Dandino, you're Executive Director and Associate Provost at Colorado State University, who was just speaking. He's host of URU since 2013, and myself, Julia Michaels, URU Director of Development and Strategic Partnerships. Today, we're delighted to welcome Dr. Ian F. McNeely to Reinventing You. Ian is Professor of History and Senior Associate Dean for Undergraduate Education at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and the author of the forthcoming book, which is the main subject of our podcast today, entitled The University Unfettered, Public Higher Education in an Age of Disruption, which will appear within Columbia University Press later this year. Ian specializes in German history and European cultural history, but also has deep roots in global comparative history and in historical sociology. He received his BA at Harvard University in 1992 and his MA and PhD from the University of Michigan in 1993 and 1998, respectively. Prior to joining UNC Chapel Hill, Dr. McNeely was a longtime member of the faculty at the University of Oregon, including service as faculty in residence at the Clark Honors College from 2021 to 2024. Welcome, Ian.
Welcome, Ian.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're so delighted that you're able to join us. I'll just get things going with that first question, which I think our listeners will really appreciate. The University Unfettered is a great book. It's just a terrific book. And we're grateful to have this early look that you provided, prior to its forthcoming publication this year. When is it due out exactly? Do you have a better sense of when we might be able to expect?
Yeah, they tell me
it-
late March, early April, coming your way in hard copy, paperback, and e-PDF. I think.
That sounds great.
Well, Ian, since it is forthcoming, could you tell our listeners, who are mainly colleagues interested in undergraduate education at research universities, what this book is about?
Yeah, I call it a retrospective stress test on public universities between the Great Recession and COVID-19. So I had gotten into first university service and then as a faculty committee chair and then as an associate dean. In almost direct response to the Great Recession, I figured that this was a big global event. Something was going to happen to higher ed, and I was not mistaken. So I did that in various roles, mainly focused on undergraduate education, all the way through the pandemic. And then I stepped down, I had a sabbatical and just had learned a lot from that and decided to write it up. So when I went on sabbatical, I thought I was done with admin. I wanted to sort of say how the sausage was made. And I started with 8 questions. Why does tuition go up? Is administrative bloat a real issue? Does DEI actually accomplish anything? And I just sat down, that flowed out of me in about 6 months, fastest thing I've ever written. And I didn't want to, it wasn't an expose. I hope it won't be read as such, but anyone who wants to know kind of what happens behind closed doors, who's got a seat at the table, how does money influence decision making, how those decisions get made, what is the mainspring of university behavior at the core of administrative action. And basically, I argue that the mainspring of all universities is rivalry and competition with peers. And so in every individual instance, whether you're competing for students or research funding or faculty members, or to be ahead of the pack in DEI, whatever it might be, it's that rivalry and competition that drives things forward. I wanted to explain why that's the case and not just state that it is the case. I wanted to show how that kind of prime directive manifests in a lot of daily decisions in university life.
That is so fascinating. When I as you've already intimated, just in that first response, the University Unfettered is a case study. And, when I was looking at and thinking about it, I thought of some old books that I had read in the past, especially like the 1991 UNC Chapel Hill Press volume, The Case for the Case Study, which, made a big impression on me when it came out. And there's a more recent 2022 Cambridge University Press book called The Case for Case Studies. Methodologically speaking, what's the case for this case study, for your case study?
Yeah, the case is that the university I talk about underwent some really dramatic changes over the time period that were directly triggered by public disinvestment. And I wanted to use the drama of that story to introduce readers to a lot of the wider policy discussions going on. So I personally am a governance geek. I love to read articles and books about responsibility, center management, and key performance indicators, but I know that not everyone shares that passion. So I use the case study of a single university that experienced dramatic change that triggered the dissolution of the entire state university system in its home state, that went on to enjoy the largest philanthropic donation at that time in the history of public higher education. And along the way had something like 5 presidents and 6 provosts, just unbelievable leadership turnover. And the way I disciplined myself was, precisely because I had been in some of these rooms and admittedly not others, I did not want it to be an expose. I didn't want it to be a tell-all. I wanted it to rely, since I'm an historian, on permanently publicly available archival sources. So every source in the book, with 1 or 2 exceptions, is available on the Wayback Machine. And if you really want to know that budget spreadsheet and research dollar calculations, it's all accessible at a click. And I hope that anyone who's crazy enough to follow some of those footnotes will see that there's nothing insidious going on behind the scenes. It really is honest, hardworking administrators trying to do the right thing. But I did want to tell a dramatic story. I wanted to use the details to keep things spicy, because I did experience them as a junior administrator at the time. And I think it did say a lot about what was happening in higher ed. So again, some of the questions are questions you find everywhere: administrative bloat, rising tuition, research rankings. Some of the trends are admittedly unique: the dismantling of the university system, the unionization of the faculty, having a world famous big donor. But the common denominator, I think, in this case study is to show how a sub-elite public research university operates. Not a private, not an Ivy League, not an Ivy Plus, not a public Ivy, but one that's pretty darn good. Not necessarily the top, but part of that species of 125-ish research universities who are in URU and are educating the majority by far of US college-going students, accounting for about half the research. What is life like in a archetypical mid to high range public university?
Well, I think, Ian, your comments just right there illustrate the mission of these types of institutions. In your book, you write at one point that excellence and access are the twin missions of public universities, on page 263, I believe it is. So how do you feel about URU's Boyer 2030 report and the focus on the equity excellence imperative? How do you see, based on what you've done in your research, these 2 goals as being inextricably entwined?
Yeah, and let me offer one slight correction to page 263. Between the galleys and the final, I changed excellence and access to excellence and equity, because I was reading the very
Even
final.
better.
Even better, I thought, here's a chance for a shout out to Boyer 2030. Equity and access sounded a little bit too 1999 to me. And I'll say that, that tension really animates my daily life as an administrator. I think you're talking about 2 rival goods: excellence and equity, or excellence and access, or however you want to talk about it. They're intertwined, but they're also sometimes at odds. So, just to take an example that probably a lot of our listeners will understand, do you allow generous transfer credit policies so that students who start gen ed at a community college can import that into a flagship research university? Or do you focus a lot of your effort on standing up a 21st century gen ed curriculum using the expertise of faculty who are recruited in high competitive searches and really bring them into the classroom to share that? How do you balance, in that case, the equity of providing wide access versus the excellence of faculty research? And that's the type of tension, the type of productive tension that I just love in my daily work. I do have one way in which I suggest we put our thumb on the scales, which is to say when that tension is either unresolvable or you have to take a fork in the road, it's the universities themselves that should favor excellence and states should favor access or equity. That what universities are best at is generating excellence, and what states need to contribute to the bargain is smoothing the way through policy, through financial support, through other means to make that excellence as widely distributed and equitably distributed as possible to all the publics that any given university serves.
We're getting into it now. This is juicy stuff. And I hope listeners are excited to, pick up this volume when it's available just in a few short months. I have kind of a long question next that I'd like to pose. Ian, I'm sorry, it's a little bit convoluted, my fault. You write, as I read through it, you say at one point, I confess, early in the book, I confess, quote unquote, that, you have some profound ambivalence about what the public university has become as a historian over time, profound ambivalence about what it's become. So I'm wondering, how much of this ambivalence that you talk about results from the University Unfettered's focus on how public universities must, at least from the point of view of the participant leader like yourself, navigate these sort of entrenched contradictions and conflicts in our kind of society, the liberal democratic society that in which we're operating in large scale, as opposed to, say, pursuing, as you also talk about, revolutionary disruption, or for that matter, large scale reform of universities themselves. So then again, as I'm reading through the whole book, there's also parts where, you're arguing that it's high time for a reckoning, which kind of gives that sense of, it's time to move forward in a dramatic manner. So could you say a little bit more, please, for my benefit, and I hope for everyone's, about the kind of the level of magnitude of change that you think is needed in public universities in the United States, and how that change is most apt, in your view, to come about?
Yeah. Well, much to my surprise, the whole thrust of the book wound up being very institutionally conservative. When I got into undergrad ed, it was precisely because I thought we were about to experience some type of revolutionary disruption in the trail of the Great Recession. And I wanted to reinvent gen ed. I wanted to reinvent online. I wanted to abolish majors. I can't tell you how many bright ideas I had that went nowhere. And it was in the process of kind of sitting down and figuring out why things didn't change that I came to the realization that universities are structurally configured to not move. And we say that a lot. We say, these, ivy colored covered walls have been around since medieval times, but it's actually not a matter of institutional inertia, but it's reproduced every day by administrators in the trenches who are really just trying to hold up the tent. And the reason they're doing this is that the creativity, the innovation, the ferment, the change, that's happening about 3 or 4 levels beneath your typical administrator. And our job is to kind of hold up the structure so that faculty and students have a secure, to switch metaphors, feet on the ground to do cool things. And so it's precisely the stability of the university at the top level that makes the ferment possible at the lower level. And the stress test was to show how did universities weather all of these storms, leadership turnover, escalating tuition, the pandemic, and preserve that core mission. Because the other part of it for me was not to succumb to golden age thinking, to say, oh, it used to be better when the California Master Plan was the blueprint. So the reckoning that I think that is ahead of us is not within the university, but within wider society. There's a secondary argument in the book about how higher education has become basically a surrogate for America's missing welfare state. If you go to the URU conference, there's a lot about food insecurity and mental health and basic services that a lot of our students don't have because the middle class has been hollowed out, because K-12 education has been neglected, because of large swaths of disadvantaged, left behind communities. And we are, as a sector, trying to step in and remedy those deficits. The problem is, and forgive me for going on about this because it's a fairly complicated argument, but that we've become victims of our own success by inadvertently buying into the argument that you need a 4-year degree in order to be successful in life. The student success agenda really is a college completion agenda that recognizes that if you don't get a 4-year degree, you're going to have substandard healthcare, economic insecurity, cultural marginalization, and if you believe the economists, even you're likely to die sooner. And so the tragedy is that we're paying the price for this misalignment, or for lack of a better word, class conflict in our society, such that we're at a state now where higher education defines socioeconomic class, and therefore class conflict takes the form of anti-intellectualism. So resentments and insecurities that are spring from economic insecurity take the form of anti-DEI, anti-wokeness, anti-political correctness. And that's where I think the reckoning is going to happen, and is probably beginning to happen in our midst even more than in prior years.
Can I follow up quickly and ask, so this institutional conservatism that you kind of discovered in the working through of your study of the case in the book, I think you're saying it's a progressive position, and that, could you maybe say a little bit more about that, why that makes a lot of sense for us as educators who have democratic sensibilities and are seeking to strengthen our form of society, how institutional conservatism at that high level is really something we ought to think about and pursue in our work.
Yeah, and that's another way of coming back to the excellence, equity imperative. That is the institutional decision making, the incentives, the culture. They're all aligned behind maintaining the public mission of a public university in the teeth of forces that push against that. So I do delve in, get pretty down into the weeds about responsibility-centered management, where and forgive me again, but I track the tuition flow. How are these students paying lots of money from wealthy families? How does their tuition wind up in the pockets of those from less fortunate families? How does it manage to maintain the full spectrum of disciplines across the liberal arts and the sciences and the professional field? So I wanted to show that it's precisely this conservatism that, on a really deep level, informs the decisions of administrators who are always balancing these equity versus access, liberal arts versus STEM, careerism versus citizenship education. And at our best, as you say, the most progressive path forward, the most democratic path forward, is to trust them that when you take off the policy shackles, when you take off a lot of the ideological polarization, these institutions can be trusted to fulfill their missions in ways that they have always done, just under more trying circumstances now than perhaps in past decades.
Well, this is a great lead into my next question, which is about the interesting times that we live in right now. So no book author, not even an accomplished historian and historical sociologist such as yourself, can quite anticipate just what will be the state of play several years ahead when the book you're working on will see the light of day. But how does your forthcoming book look in light of most recent events? Does it speak to our moment in any unexpected or unanticipated ways?
I would like to think so. I mean, I don't know, you're right, what's happening next. I just came out of a meeting where I quoted myself to chill out because I was in a bit of a heated state about some political shenanigans that are happening in our midst. I finished the book before we knew the outcome of the 2024 election, so I had to write it in a way that would sort of be appropriate whether Harris or Trump won. And so I sort of attempted to game out kind of what are the long-term structural forces at play that could continue to exert their effect irrespective of policy lurches in one way or another. I will say that in the short term, the policy lurches may be quite extreme. We may be in for a rough ride. Federal grant dollars, for example, are an enormous lever that can be used, for example, to expunge DEI from the curriculum. Something completely unrelated to federal contracting can then be used to hold hostage universities for whatever pound of flesh the policymakers want to extract. It's possible that regional accreditors will be stripped of their powers and that check and balance will be removed. It's possible that there will be long-term damage to the competitiveness of American higher education for all these reasons. But when I thought about, when the dust settles and assuming we're not looking at a truly authoritarian outcome, where are the checks and balances? Where are the incentives? Where is the hope for higher education? And here I lean very heavily on our federal system of government. Higher education, like K-12 education, is a function of the 50 states, not of the federal government, which makes it different from, say, the military or Social Security or what the Federal Reserve does or anything like that. And that states have an incentive to compete with one another in higher education, just as they do on the football field. There's a line in the book where I say, if you see someone wearing a sweatshirt with the name of a state on it, it's not that they're passionate about the state, it's they're passionate about the flagship university in that state. And a corollary to that is that when one state does something that damages its public flagship universities, it's like sending a gift basket to the other 49 states. It's like saying, we, for whatever reason, have decided to fetter our university, and that will simply damage it in competition with other universities across the country. The university that I talk about in the book very much benefited from that. Other universities may not be so lucky. I don't want to be kind of look at the whole system with rose-colored glasses, but I will say that this inter-institutional, interstate competition is a feature of higher education going very far back. And if there is a cause to be a little bit calmer than perhaps many of us are at this particular moment, it's that has always been a guarantor of quality and excellence over long stretches of time.
Yeah, thank you for that, Ian. What an important statement you just offered. Really appreciate it. You mentioned the university that is the subject of your book, and lots of good reasons for not naming it. It makes all the sense in the world since you're trying to draw larger implications. Maybe for our listeners, is it fair of us to ask you if you could maybe, identify a few really key takeaways that you would hope any reader studying this particular case might take from reading through the book, and maybe connect it to what you just said, because here we are faced with all these great challenges before us, yet we have this responsibility, these opportunities as well to make progress in our work, and it's such important work. What might the reader anticipate as being some of the big lessons that they're going to gain from getting this book and going through it?
Yeah, I think, some of the basics that universities are hardwired to compete with their peers in a marketplace of ideas. That marketplace of ideas goes way back. It's not a recent development. A lot of the things that feel like privatization or corporatization or neoliberalism or the abandonment of the public university with generous state support from the 20th century, those are not new phenomena. If anything, they go all the way back to the city-states of ancient Greece and the urban universities of the Middle Ages and the interstate competition of 18th and 19th century Germany that birthed the research university as we know it, and that inspired the interstate competition of the American. I could go on and on. And I do find that reassuring. It's a competitiveness. It's a friendly rivalry. it takes the form not of a mean-spirited competition, but a common quest for excellence. And again, to give a shout out to you, we go to these conferences and we blithely steal from one another. We do not want to hoard all the innovations, but to share them with the world so that everybody can level up in that way. And hopefully that's a very familiar message. What I hope also readers will take away is a visceral, on the ground understanding of how that animates everyday decision making. It's not just a noble aspiration. It's actually operationalized in the way universities behave at a very ground level.
Did you hear that, Julia? We got to hear Dr. McNeely, the historian, just a second ago. We were in Germany. We were in city-states in ancient world. Good stuff. Thanks for that. Good
Yes.
reminder.
Yes, thank you. Ian, any last thoughts? Anything we didn't cover that you'd like to share with our audience?
Just to loop back to something I think I did say, which is that one more lesson of the book is that the future is in some ways the flagship, or the future is the non-elite R1, R2 universities. We spend so much time in the press talking about the Harvards of the world, heck, even the Chapel Hills of the world, to name my current institution. And, it's really this experiment in higher education encompasses a much wider swath, going, for lack of a better word, all the way down. And I don't want to say that in a hierarchical sense. One other takeaway, didn't quite make it into the book per se, but part of the background, I had an ACE fellowship, whereas for your listeners, you get to do an administrative internship, and I visited, I don't know, 12 or 13 universities across the country. No matter whether they're high up on the rankings list or in the middle or quote at the bottom, they're all basically feel the same. The crises are the same. The problems are the same. The dysfunction is the same. But somehow this anarchical system produces excellence. And I just really want to signal a discomfort with an elitist view of higher education. It's a corollary of my view that these are truly public institutions.
Well, that's a great way to end. Thank you, Ian. What a pleasure to have this conversation. And again, congratulations on this terrific forthcoming book. URU members can log in to My URU to hear 2 additional questions with Ian and some concluding discussion for UVPs and their colleagues. For now, though, thanks to listeners of Reinventing You, a podcast of the Association for Undergraduate Education at Research Universities, or URU. Reinventing You is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. To learn more about URU, check us out at URU, that's ueru.org.
Julia, you're ready for NPR, man. Come on. That's great. Thank you.
Do you want to do the
Yes,
extended
thank you.
questions now?
Yeah, let's do them now. We just
Okay.
take a little break, and then,
Mhm.
we'll just edit that out, and then we'll just roll right into these. So, Ian, I hear in your analysis, echoes of Menand's Marketplace of Ideas, Thorpe and Goldstein's Our Higher Calling, which has that great Chapel Hill, basis, the collective works of David Reisman in Sociology of Higher Education. I mean, there's some context here out of which your work grows. And, how do you position yourself intellectually within the American tradition of higher ed critique and reform, from Emerson to Veblen, to bell hooks, however you'd like to do it. And are there some authors that, and works maybe which you regard as especially valuable for those of us who are, trying to understand better the historical and, contemporary landscape? Give us some guideposts, that might, help people better understand your book and just the larger topic that we're working on.
Yeah, I guess to start with the last part, probably the biggest influence on my own thinking has been David Labry's A Perfect Mess, which argues essentially that American higher education has been an anarchic free market from the beginning, from colonial times, punctuated by a couple of fits of coordination that correspond with wars, the Civil War and the Cold War. And a lot of what my book tries to do is apply that long-term perspective to the single case study of the 2010s. In that respect, it's also a rejoinder to Chris Newfield's The Great Mistake and a lot of the very influential, very compelling arguments about how public universities have lost their way. I have great admiration for those, and I share all of their concerns. So part of me wants to offer a rebuttal or a rejoinder that's really founded on a long-term faith in the system. I love all those reform manifestos, the Louis Menand. There, I have everything written by Derek Bach. Holden Thorpe is a mentor of mine. Yes, his presence looms large on the Chapel Hill campus. But part of what I also am trying to do is to show why reform calls do not ultimately issue into institutional changes. As much as I love to read these books, saying something and seeing it implemented in university behavior are two different things. So when I think about my longer term influences, I actually go, because I'm a German historian by training, a European intellectual historian. I'll just make a shameless plug for another book I wrote called Reinventing Knowledge from Alexandria to the Internet. My lodestar is sort of the German wave of reform circa 1800, and the name Wilhelm von Humboldt may ring a bell. That reform gave us the University of Berlin. It gave us the modern research university system. It gave us a system that was founded on interstate competition within a still disunified Germany. And it gave us some of the basic principles of academic freedom that, in my view, still remain hardwired into university behavior, even if they're always under threat. So the freedom to learn and the freedom to teach, the freedom to pursue knowledge that is it has not been fully established, but is always a kind of continuous Byronic romantic quest. I take a lot of my inspiration from that epoch of German idealism and the way in which that set of ideals was in fact institutionalized. So Immanuel Kant's conflict of the faculties is something that I carry around like the Constitution for universities. And I know that's like, you can't get much deeper than Kant, but that's where I'm going to hang my hat.
That's fantastic. Shout out to Dr. Thorpe for his contribution to the Boyer 2030 Commission. And, we were fortunate to host Buck Goldstein once at a URU conference. Really appreciate his support too in the past. One last question, kind of inside baseball for our URU listeners who are like yourself, deeply engaged in the work of supporting undergraduates in our research universities. What if you were a cynic kind of person, someone who's been around, seen it all, and you were look at the case study that you've delved into at such great length, and you were just to say quip, maybe something like, oh, I know this case study in 3 words: California and Air Jordans. How would you kind of push back against someone who wants to reduce the complexity of what goes on at a public university just by talking about demographics, and student recruitment, or as you mentioned a few times in our conversation, a rather unusual and generous donor who helped support the particular institution?
Yeah, California and Air Jordans. What is the intersection of that Venn diagram? Could it possibly be the University of Oregon? Indeed, for your listeners who are logged on to this special segment of the podcast, that is the case study we've been talking about. It's I don't have any compunction about revealing that because it's pretty obvious in the book. It is the reason I tried to anonymize it, not to kind of protect my colleagues, not to avoid throwing shade. It's actually, I hope, a very even-handed approach. It was precisely so that I would not be able to rely upon the drama of that institution or of its largest donor or of its largest supplier of out-of-state students, the state of California, but just sort of discipline myself to think in every case about the larger trends. And to which I can only reply to the cynic, your results may vary. I discover every day the way in which different states have different cultures, different politics. But I will come back to what I said earlier. It's remarkably similar down in the engine room. I might add also in private universities as well. It's not like they have it all figured out either. So if that's any consolation to those listeners who are in the trenches, it's the same everywhere.
Well, again, on behalf of Julia, myself, all our listeners, thanks again, Ian, for you're taking time to share these thoughts with the Reinventing You audience, and especially for all the work that went into this terrific book. I hope people will consider purchasing it or finding access to it in one way or another. Columbia University Press. You said again, maybe March, April of this year. Is that right?
Probably April 1st-ish to be safe.
Oh, well, very good. Well, we'll look for it. Thank you again. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.